Well, hello everybody. My name is Jason DeCosta. Welcome to my show, and I thank you for joining me today. Today we're going to be talking about the resurrection hope, that the Bible outlines for us. We're going to be talking about who that resurrection hope was. And my goal here today is to show you that the Bible absolutely 100% posits the resurrection as exclusive to Israel, It was the hope of Israel, just like Paul called it. All right, and nobody further. And if we can show that today, then we can kind of start to understand why the idea of a continuous gospel just goes right out the window, because it really doesn't pertain to anybody outside of the elect and those who are in focus of the story from cover to cover. All right, so we're going to get to that in a moment, but before we do that, I wanted to touch on a few things in my early unrelated rant section of my show. Still haven't thought of a name for the show yet. I guess I'm still working on it, but I may just keep it untitled, because I think a title, would have to be really good, because this show covers a wide variety of topics and goes up and down and left and right. So I don't want to limit my show by putting a title on it. So we'll just roll with it for now. But if you haven't subscribed to my channel on YouTube, please do. I don't bite. I'm not a mean guy. I'm actually a nice guy. People like me. But what I don't like is dishonesty. All right. And I don't like motive, dishonesty based on motive and based on, how something affects a person, whether or not they, admit it's true. In other words, I don't like when people who are very intelligent and very skilled in the Word of God, act as if they can't see something that's so very clear to all of us on the other side, and it's sort of like when full preterists engage futurists, and they, cannot believe for the life of them that futurists cannot see this stuff, which is right in front of their face, and they bang their head against the wall and they act, holier than thou and everything. But it's the same kind of thing. We've progressed in our doctrine and in our theology and in our studies to the point where we see the full picture, and we understand that the story ended and the story never pertained to us. But there are people in the full preterist community, teachers, pastors, just basic, believers, who will not admit this. They refuse to admit what's so very clear and so very obvious. And so that kind of stuff just really bothers me. And that's the kind of stuff that kind of sets me off a little bit and puts me in my cocky mood and makes me get a little sarcastic and a little bit angry and all that. So, but all in all, I'm a pretty good guy. If you ever met me in person and you've known me, you know that I would give the shirt off my back for just about anybody. But I just don't like dishonesty. That, to me, that is the lowest of lows. Especially when it's because of your financial situation and the position that you're in that is not allowing you to be honest. I wrote 2 books, The Kingdom of Christ and The Genesis of Israel, over the last 2 years. And I could care less if I sold another copy of either of those books. Honestly, I could care less. Number one, I don't need the money. I did it because I wanted to do it. And number two, even if I did need the money, if the things which I believe aren't true and the things which I teach aren't true, then I don't care. It's not, I'm not going to sell books just to get financial gain, to keep me in a comfort zone, while all the while knowing that what I'm teaching is untrue. That's not my style. And I guess I expect everybody to be that way as well, but unfortunately that's not the case. So anyways, if you haven't subscribed to me, please do. You can follow my teachings, and I will progressively take you through these things, these tough items. And I've already got a bunch of audios up on my YouTube channel, which will give you a really good foundation in these things. They cover a whole array of topics. So, when people comment on my posts that I've never met before, random people that just pop up and they start asking me questions and they start trying to argue with me, and, it gets exhaustive, because I've done the work. I've put in the man hours to produce these audios for a reason. And that reason is so that people can go and can listen to them and can formulate an understanding of what I believe and what I teach. So does that mean you can't ask me questions? Of course not. I love asking questions if it's done in the proper tone. And if you don't come on my page saying you're here to crush IO like one bonehead did a few weeks back. If everything is done in the proper tone and with respect, then you'll get respect out of me. All right? So anyways, I'm excited about today's teaching about the resurrection because I feel like it is a clear-cut, undeniable truth that I'm about to show you. And I'll take you through the scriptures by the hand and show you how I arrived at this conclusion. But before we do that, I wanted to talk about a couple things. So obviously, you know that yesterday William Bell put out a 30-page essay trying to explain his view, at the same time refute mine, which he was very unsuccessful in doing. I got some really great feedback today from a bunch of people that reached out to me privately and also publicly, and offered up encouragement and just basically told me to hang in there and don't get carried away with all the hype and all the distractions and the smoke screens, and just continue to do what I'm doing, because it's helping a lot of people understand the story. And that's what keeps me going here, because if I got caught up in all the fluff and the smoke screen and the dishonesty, I would lose focus on what I'm trying to do, and that is to understand the story for myself. Okay, yes, the story does not pertain to me, okay, but I have a desire to want to know what this story is about. Okay, it's like anything. If you have a hobby and you enjoy doing it, you pursue it and you do it. Okay, that's what this has become to me, and I want to see why it is that people believe what they believe and compare it to what the Bible actually says. And I won't be completely content until I figure. Sorry about that. I just had to take a quick call. Not sure if that's going to break up, but I think where I left off was that I was saying that I need to focus on, I won't be content until I figure this story out from start to finish. In other words, I know the parameters, I know where I can go with it, I know how far I can push it, but there's things in the inside that are just bugging me that I want to figure out. And it doesn't have anything to do with the redemptive elements and the fact that salvation belonged to them and the promises belong to them, and that's all been long fulfilled. But just little things, when you're anal about something, you want to figure it out. And I don't think that I'll be able to rest until I have a good grasp on certain things that bug me. But again, let me repeat, that has nothing to do with the possibility of this story extending beyond the end of Israel's days. That much I am absolutely positive of, okay? So anyways, got a lot of good feedback today. Got some people who had told me that, just like I thought, that they were very confused about William Bell's essay and what he's actually trying to do there. And they said, basically the same sort of thing. It's a lot of words. It seems like there's a lot of irrelevant information there. In fact, one lady told me that some of the things that he said didn't even really make sense to her. Like they made these graphs, and they were basically trying to pin me against the Bible, and William Bell did the old, he plays on the emotional card of the Christian and choose this day who you will serve, as if I'm like some demon, versus what the truth of the Bible says. He kind of pinned me up against that, and then he did the same thing with me and Michael Barris, who's a good friend of mine. And then he even tried doing it with Rivers of Eden, who is the arch nemesis of Dr. Don Preston, who's obviously Bell's right-hand man. He tried to sort of get on Rivers of Eden's good side in the essay, if you didn't catch that little, how he appreciates him. So basically, like I said, he's a master of this stuff. He's trying to cause chaos in between the proponents of the view, which was unsuccessful, by the way, because me and Mike were laughing about it last night. But, he's trying to cause chaos and try to get things to be all messed up within the proponents of the view, but it's just not working. But all in all, I think we saw how he skirted around the core issues that I presented, and he didn't lock horns with them. He never once defeated the mile-high boundary walls that trap his false doctrine that he is spiritual Israel today. I will repeat, all spiritual Israel was already saved, okay? The fullness of the Gentiles came in by the end of the age, and as Paul said, in this way all Israel will be saved. And they were saved, and they inherited the promises that were given to their fathers, all right? And one thing I was trying to think about, well, before we do that, I want to read to you a little bit of William Bell's essay here on page 3 when he talks about me and the law. So he says this, quote, DeCosta claims that the curse is the curse of the law. He cites Galatians 3:10-13, which says, "For as many as are of the works of the law are under the curse. For it is written, Cursed is everyone who does not continue in all things which are written in the book of law to do them. Christ has redeemed us from the curse of the law, having become a curse for us. For it is written, Cursed is everyone who hangs on a tree." And then he says this, "Now if the curse results from the law, and only those who are under the law are under the curse, then it must be the case that Adam, in his fall, was under the law. If not, then DeCosta and Io must," and then he lists 4 things. Well, that is exactly what I'm saying, Mr. William Bell, because I understand that where there is no law, there is no imputation of sin. Okay, so Adam had to have law in order to have imputation of sin. The two don't work any other way. So let me repeat what he says. He says, "Now if the curse results from the law, and only those who are under the law are under the curse, then it must be the case that Adam, in his fall, was under the law. If not, then DeCosta and Io must, 1, back off their claim that only those under the law were under the curse. 2, admit that the law of Moses was given in the garden. 3, but if one is cursed by sin apart from the law, then the curse fell upon me." I don't even know what that means. 4, that falsifies the doctrine of DeCosta and Io on this point, and I'm leaving my PayPal address in the link below so he can send my $500 check. And that is hilarious because that didn't falsify anything, all right? Not a thing. So then he goes on and he says this, "To reiterate the point, Adam fell under the curse when he sinned, all right? Only those under the law of Moses are under the curse, per DeCosta and Io." That's false. He says, "Therefore, Adam fell under the curse of the law of Moses in the garden." It's false, but that's the simple logic of Io, and it's not rocket science. So you can see what Mr. Bell does here. He completely botches what I believe. He builds a straw man case to get people to believe that he's actually refuting my points. I've never said that Adam was under the Mosaic law. But I'm smart enough to understand that it's very clear from the Bible that without law, there is no imputation of sin. So that didn't change. That wasn't invented when the Mosaic law came, okay? Where was the first imputation of sin in this biblical story? Anybody will tell you it was in the garden, was it not? So do you believe that Paul in Romans 5 says that where there is no law, there is no imputation of sin? Is that not relevant, and does that not pertain to what we see happen in the garden? Okay, in other words, Adam had imputed sin, correct? I think we'd all agree. So didn't Adam have to also have law to have imputed sin, or was Paul not speaking of Adam? Of course he was speaking of Adam, because he starts that whole point off by saying, "Through one man sin entered the world." And what does he go on to say? Where there is no law, there is no sin. So in other words, he says sin was in the world before the commandment came, but where there is no law, sin is not imputed. And the world there is the covenant world. We all know that, okay? It was those guilty under the law. So Mr. Bell is trying to make the case that I believe that the law of Moses was back in the garden, which I've never said. What I did say, though, is that there had to be a law in the garden. Otherwise, Adam would have never had imputed sin. Because like Paul very clearly says, where there is no law, there is no imputation of sin. And guess what that means, Mr. Bell? There is no guilt. So if Adam had guilt and was guilty and had imputation of sin, which of course he did, because that's the whole story, then indeed there was law. All right, and then Mr. Bell's last paragraph here says, "Yet, DeCosta denies that he says Adam was under the law of Moses." You bet your bottom I do, because I never said it. He says, "Then if not, Adam is not under the curse of the law of Moses." Right, because the law of Moses came well after. If he was not under the curse of the law of Moses, under what law was he? Because he surely died from sin. Exactly. So again, Mr. Bell is a very confused individual. All right. The tree of knowledge of good and evil gave knowledge of pre-existing sin. Okay, what the law does, okay, the law tells us what's right and what's wrong. It tells us what's good and what's evil, okay, and what's good and what's bad. See, evil in the Bible actually just means bad, okay? It doesn't really mean evil in the sense of demons and goblins. It just means good and bad. So you could actually call that tree of knowledge, you could call it the tree of knowledge of good and bad, all right? And that's exactly what a law is. It's a tree of knowledge of good and bad. A law dictates and tells and defines us what is good and what is bad based on, a particular jurisdiction, all right? So this law, this law that was in the garden, which is portrayed and symbolized by the tree of knowledge of good and bad, was indeed the law. Okay, it was. Now remember, Genesis is very highly symbolic. Okay, there's a lot going on there. There's a talking snake. Adam's eyes were closed, so you can't take everything completely literal. Okay, and I've always maintained that the tree of knowledge of good and evil represented the law in some form or fashion, and when Adam ate of that tree, symbolically representing that he chose to break that law, that's when the imputation took place, and that's when his guilt began, and that's when the bondage began, as you see that he would now toil and sweat, and the woman would bring forth children in pain and sorrow. This is all representative of being born into the law and being born under that system of bondage that God had placed upon the people. All right, so, but back to that eyes being closed thing. What exactly does Mr. Bell think Adam's eyes being closed actually meant? All right, why was Adam's eyes closed? Does Mr. Bell actually think that Adam's eyes were sewed shut? Okay, and that he could not open his actual eyelids? Does he take this literally? Of course he doesn't. All right, nobody does. Okay, so what then does he think that means? Why were Adam's eyes symbolically and metaphorically closed? All right, Mr. Bell claims that Adam was perfect before the fall, doesn't he? He says that Adam was walking in pure harmony with God, and he had no imputation because, after all, Mr. Bell believes sin is the main issue here. All right, so obviously it would have to mean that Adam was not sinning, okay, before the fall. So Mr. Bell views Adam as this perfect individual who was walking in perfect harmony with God before the fall came. All right, but the main issue here is that Adam's eyes were closed, okay? And so we got to do something with that. So what does that actually mean? What does Adam's eyes being closed before the fall actually mean? Well, again, it ties in with what Paul says in Romans 7, where he says, I was alive once without the law, but when the commandment came, I died. All right? That means basically that before that law, that commandment was given, which imputed sin and which killed, okay, and brought the death, he was alive. Adam was alive. His eyes were closed. He was naked and unashamed. And his eyes being closed, folks, really simply only means that he had sin. He was a sinner, okay? But he was totally unaware, all right? He was naked and unashamed, all right? There was no covering, okay? Because he was a sinner. There was no law to impute his sin. There was no standard by which to hold him accountable to. And so his eyes were closed. He was totally unaware of his already existing sin. Okay? But when the commandment came, sin took opportunity by that commandment and brought the death. All right? It's very simple. Okay? So Mr. Bell has no explanation for Adam's eyes being closed before he partook of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. All right? And again, this plays into what I've said here, that the tree of knowledge of good and evil, of good and bad, did not create good and bad. It just gave knowledge of good and bad. It gave knowledge of what was right and what was wrong according to God's standard in the law. Okay? So again, the eyes being closed simply means that Adam was walking in harmony, even though he was a sinner. And as Paul said, even though sin was in the world, sin was not imputed because there was no law. But when that commandment came, sin, picture a snake, no pun intended with the serpent, but picture a snake that's, lurking, and then when it sees that commandment, it lashes out, okay, and it kills. All right, and that's exactly what sin did, but the strength of sin was the law. So without that law, sin was basically in a dormant state, and it had no power to kill. All right, so Mr. Bell's very confused, and he's also confused because sin is gone, by the way. All right, in regards to the Bible and what the Bible actually says, if you look at Daniel chapter 9, when the 70 weeks were completed, sin was actually gone, okay? It says it would make an end of sins and it would finish the transgression. And this is what we see in Matthew chapter 23, where Jesus is calling out the last days Jews and he's telling them they are filling up the measure of their father's guilt. And he brings that all the way back to Cain, who killed their father Abel. All right, so he says, you're filling up the measure of your father's guilt. Well, at the end of that, when that bucket was completely filled with sin and it overflowed and exploded, that's when all sin went away. That's when the transgression went away, and as Daniel said, it would make an end of sins and it would finish the transgression. And that is directly related to the fact that the law went away. Every jot and tittle, there would be no more law. Okay, so when we get to the Mosaic law, it basically was just an increase of laws, which brought an increase of sins. Okay, that's really all it is. All right, it made sin more exceedingly sinful. All right, but there was always law there, okay, and there was always imputed sin right up until right back to the time of Adam, which went right through. But when the Mosaic law came, it made sin exceedingly sinful, okay, because it was an increase of laws, which, of course, brought an increase of sin, because, again, where there is no law, there is no sin. So if you have a whole multitude of laws, of course, you have exceeding sin, okay? So just a lot of things that Mr. Bell gets wrong here, and I'm sure you can all see that now. But we're going to stop talking about Mr. Bell here because I want to get into this teaching because it's very good. All right, and we're going to start in Matthew chapter 14. Sorry, I didn't pull this one up. Bear with me one moment. I just want to get you to chew on this for a minute. I'm sorry, Matthew chapter 24, verse 14. Now, we all know the Olivet Discourse. This is the go-to place for all the preterists when they're beating the futurists over the head with their doctrine and saying, see, it's all fulfilled, but yet we're still in it, and they're wrong. It's funny because the bully is bullying someone, and the bully doesn't even realize that he's wrong, okay? But here's what I want you to read. Matthew chapter 24, verse 14, all right? We'll actually read from verse 9. It says, then they will deliver you up to tribulation and kill you, and you will be hated by all nations for my name's sake. And then many will be offended, will betray one another, and will hate one another. Then many false prophets will rise up and deceive many. And because lawlessness will abound, the love of many will grow cold. But he who endures to the end shall be saved. Okay, so we see an end, and we see salvation being inherited at that end. But here's the passage I want you to take note of. Verse 14 says this, and this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in all the world as a witness to all the nations, and then the end will come. All right, so let's think about this for a second. Have you ever really stopped and thought about that? Okay, I'm going to break it down logically. All right, so the end of the gospel, according to Jesus, came after the gospel was preached to all the nations. All right, let's read it again. He says, and this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in all the world to all the nations, and then the end will come. So you have the gospel going out, being preached to all the nations in focus, and after the gospel was preached to all these nations, the end would come. Okay? Now, here's a question to Mr. Full Preterist, whoever's out there listening. What end was Jesus talking about? Of course, we all know he's speaking of the end of Israel's age. Okay, there is no future coming end. The Bible speaks of nothing of the sort. All right, so the end that Jesus is speaking about here is the end of Israel's days. They were in the last days. All right, so the gospel had to go out to all the nations. Okay, as a witness, it had to be preached to all those nations, and then the end would come. So unless you're a futurist, okay, and you go back to futurism and you hold to a still yet future end of Israel's days, then guess what this means, folks? All right? Let me explain it very simply. So if the end of the gospel came after it was preached to all the nations, and if that end occurred in AD 70, then guess what that means? It means there is no gospel going out to any nations today. Let's make sure we understand that. Verse 14 says this, and this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in all the world as a witness to all the nations, and then the end will come. So do you see how all the nations had to receive the gospel before the end of Israel's days? It had to happen. All right? And we know that it did. Obviously, Paul in Colossians says that the gospel has already gone out to all the world, and so on and so forth. But again, my point here is that there is absolutely no gospel going out to any nations today because the gospel had to be preached to all the nations before the end could come. All right? So whatever you're trying to do to push that into our day, it doesn't work. All right? And the Revelation 7 picture is actually perfect. That portrays this. Okay? The Revelation 7 picture, which we're going to touch on here in a minute again, is basically the picture of God going out, sealing the elect of the 12 tribes of Israel on their foreheads during those last days. Okay, and then in verse 9 of Revelation 7, we see the conclusion of that sealing when they inherited their salvation and their promise. What did we see? We see the great multitude from all the nations standing clothed in white, redeemed, saying salvation belongs to our God. And those were the 12 tribes of Israel brought back, sealed, and redeemed from all the land, from all the nations. That is the result of what Jesus just said here in Matthew chapter 24, verse 14, when he said, and this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in all the world to all the nations, and then the end will come. So the preaching to all nations had to occur before the end could come. And if the end already came, which of course we know it did, then there is no preaching going out to any nations today. Which of course ties into what I've been saying about the leaves on the tree going out for the healing of the nations. And the result of that healing of the nations would be there is no more curse. And if you go a little further in that portion, you see that only those written in the Lamb's Book of Life would inherit the new city, the New Jerusalem. And of course, we know when that Book of Life was opened, don't we? It was opened at the end of Israel's days. So there is no Book of Life today. All right, so that is just a wham, bam, thank you, ma'am, slam the door shut on your face little concept there that you can use against trolls who are trying to argue against this ever so clear point. Very, very simply, Jesus says that the gospel had to be preached to all the nations and then the end would come. So there is no gospel going out to the nations today. All right, and William Bell likes to use the checkmate, so I guess I'll use it too. But now we're going to talk about the resurrection, okay? If that wasn't enough to convince you, which I'm sure it won't be for some of you, if the resurrection can be proven to be exclusively for Israel alone, then the case is closed, all right? Then there's nothing that can be argued there, okay? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you through the passages here that the resurrection was exclusively for Israel. All right, so the first thing I want you to think about is, have you ever considered and noticed how full preterists have this new type of resurrection idea post AD 70? All right, so they fully acknowledge that the resurrection took place at the end of Israel's days and that all those who needed the resurrection actually received it in a real way. Okay, they were raised up and inherited their promise where they went to be forever with the Lord. But they keep the people that were here on the earth, and they basically say that from that point on, there's a different type of resurrection. So we're not resurrected in the same sense that Israel was resurrected, but it's slightly different now. Okay, now we, instantly receive our promise, whereas those who were in Hades waiting for that upward call and that promise, they had to wait. And then when they received it, that began the new age where we instantly receive our eternal life and our promise, which is just silly, okay? If you really think about it, the saints of those last days said that when they saw him, they would be like him. And they said they didn't understand what they would be like at that point, but when they would finally see him, they would be just like him. So that just goes to show you how far off people are. But yeah, the full preterist has developed a new style of resurrection here for the post-70 world. And it's quite interesting. And like I've said before, even the futurist gets a little bit right. They understand that at the resurrection, the story ends. Okay, they don't push anything beyond the resurrection and the inheritance of the promise. They see that as the end of the story, because clearly it is. But of course, they're 2,000 years late, and they don't realize that it already took place and it only pertained to Israel. But the point is that they get that right, and the full preterist understands the timing properly, but they wrongly carry it on after the inheritance of all the promises. But let's take you through a dozen or so passages to show you clearly that the resurrection was for Israel. Okay, we're going to go to Daniel chapter 12 first. In Daniel chapter 12, we read this in verse 1. At that time, Michael shall stand up, the great prince who stands watch over the sons of your people. And there shall be a time of trouble, such as never was since there was a nation, even to that time. And at that time, your people shall be delivered, every one who is found written in the book. And many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, some to shame and everlasting contempt. Those who are wise shall shine like the brightness of the firmament, and those who turn many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever. So we see very clearly here who the focus is on. Your people, to Daniel. Who is Daniel's people? Okay, I don't even need to tell you. You know. All right, so the focus here, Daniel is not writing about Gentiles here. Okay, he's speaking of his people the Israelites, all right? He says, at that time there shall be a time of trouble such as never was since there was a nation, even to that time. And then he says, and at that time your people shall be delivered, everyone who is found written in the book. Okay, so what do we clearly see there? We see the deliverance is related to who? To Daniel's people, all right? Nobody further, all right? And then it says that only those who are written in the book would be delivered. So therefore, the book was also exclusive to Daniel's people. No argument there, all right? So we see very clearly here that in Daniel's prophecy of the end times, it's all about his people, Israel, and at that time, they would be delivered. Where is everybody else? Nowhere. All right, when we go to, let's look at Matthew chapter 19, in verse 27, we read this. Then Peter answered and said to him, see, we have left all and followed you. Therefore, what shall we have? So Jesus said to them, assuredly I say to you, that in the regeneration, when the Son of Man sits on the throne of his glory, you who have followed me will also sit on 12 thrones, ready, judging the 12 tribes of Israel. And everyone who has left houses or brothers or sisters or father or mother or wife or children or lands for my name's sake shall receive 100-fold and inherit eternal life. But many who are first will be last and the last first. So you see how there's an ending here. Okay, there's no continuation. All right, it was up until that point in the regeneration, those who followed him would inherit that promise. But look what he says. You who have followed me will also sit on the 12 thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel. All right, and he's speaking to the apostles, of course. So, again, who's being raised here in the regeneration? The 12 tribes of Israel. Where is everybody else? Go over to Luke 22, verse 28. We can see this again. He says this, but you are those who have continued with me in my trials, and I bestow upon you a kingdom, just as my Father bestowed one upon me, that you may eat and drink at my table in my kingdom and sit on thrones judging the 12 tribes of Israel. All right, so again, who was the kingdom? It was Israel. All right, and who was going to be raised and be judged? The 12 tribes of Israel. Where is everybody else? Nowhere. When we go over to Acts chapter 26, verses 4 to 8, we read about Paul speaking to Agrippa. King Agrippa, he says this, my manner of life from my youth, which was spent from the beginning among my own nation at Jerusalem, all the Jews know. They knew me from the first, if they were willing to testify that according to the strictest sect of our religion, I lived a Pharisee. And now I stand and am judged for the hope of the promise made by God to our fathers. Ready? To this promise, our 12 tribes, earnestly serving God day and night, hope to attain. For this hope's sake, King Agrippa, I am accused by the Jews. Why should it be thought incredible by you that God raises the dead? So again, very clearly here, who was the promise made to? Israel's fathers, very clearly. He says, I now stand and am judged for the hope of the promise made by God to our fathers. All right, not King Agrippa's fathers. I'm sorry, but he's basically saying that the promise was made to the Jews, all right, and to Israel. And then he says, to this promise, our 12 tribes, earnestly serving God day and night, hope to attain. So where is everybody else in that? Where are all the foreigners hoping to attain the resurrection? They're nowhere in sight, okay, nowhere. All right, we've been told that they're there, but they're not there. All right, in Acts chapter 28, we see more of this. In verse 17, Paul says, this is about Paul's ministry at Rome. It says, and it came to pass after 3 days that Paul called the leaders of the Jews together. So when they had come together, he said to them, men and brethren, though I have done nothing against our people or the customs of our fathers, yet I was delivered as a prisoner from Jerusalem into the hands of the Romans, who, when they had examined me, wanted to let me go because there was no cause for putting me to death. But when the Jews spoke against it, I was compelled to appeal to Caesar, not that I had anything of which to accuse my nation. For this reason, therefore, I have called for you to see you and speak with you, because for the hope of Israel I am bound with this chain. So Paul very clearly says who the hope was for. It was for Israel and nobody further. Where is everybody else? Why wasn't the Romans included in that hope? No, Paul said, for the hope of Israel, which was the resurrection, like he just said 2 chapters earlier, he was bound with that chain. Now we go over to Revelation chapter 7, like I just mentioned. If you haven't listened to my Great Multitude audio I shared a few weeks ago, please do. It's a real good one. But Revelation 7 is very clear. We'll read it. It says, "After these things I saw 4 angels standing at the 4 corners of the earth, holding the 4 winds of the earth, that the wind should not blow on the earth, on the sea, or on any tree. Then I saw another angel ascending from the east, having the seal of the living God, and he cried with a loud voice to the 4 angels, to whom it was granted to harm the earth and the sea, saying, Do not harm the earth, the sea, or the trees, till we have sealed the servants of our God on their foreheads. And I heard the number of those who were sealed. 144,000 of all the tribes of the children of Israel were sealed." And then it lists all 12 tribes, and you hear of the tribe of Judah, 12,000 were sealed. Of the tribe of Reuben, 12,000 were sealed. Of the tribe of Gad, 12,000 were sealed, and so on and so forth. But the key here is the sealing, all right? Now, just to give you a little tidbit of what my audio from a few weeks ago covered, you have that picture there in Revelation 7, which was the last days picture where the gospel was going out and the messengers of God were sealing the elect on the foreheads, okay? Metaphorically meaning they were being sealed with the Holy Spirit, all right? And so then we go over just to kind of tie this to a place in a letter to a foreign church, so you can see that even the foreign churches were the 12 tribes of Israel that Revelation 7 so clearly mentions there. In Ephesians chapter 1, verse 13, we read this. "In him you also trusted after you heard the word of truth, the gospel of your salvation, in whom also, having believed," ready, "you were sealed with the Holy Spirit of promise, who is the guarantee of our inheritance until the redemption of the purchased possession to the praise of his glory." So these messengers were going out. They were sealing the servants of God on their foreheads, which, by the way, were the 12 tribes of Israel. That's very clear from Revelation 7. And we see that throughout the letters in these epistles that go to these foreign nations. These foreigners in these nations, who were the elect diaspora, they were being sealed on the forehead. They were being sealed with the Holy Spirit for the day of redemption. And, of course, they are the 12 tribes of Israel, because Revelation 7 clearly shows us who is being sealed. And then as we look at the end of Revelation 7 in verse 9, it says, "After these things I looked, and behold, a great multitude which no one could number, of all nations, tribes, peoples, and tongues, standing before the throne and the Lamb, clothed with white robes, with palm branches in their hands, and crying out with a loud voice, saying, Salvation belongs to our God." Okay? And then later on it says, he asks who these were, and he says these are the ones who came out of the great tribulation, and so on and so forth. But what's the point here? Well, the point is the beginning of Revelation 7 is the actual gospel going out to seal the elect. And then from verse 9 forward, you see the inheritance and the conclusion of that gospel mission, which was the elect, all 12 tribes of Israel from every nation, tongue, tribe, and kindred, standing sealed and clothed in white, saying salvation belongs to our God. So they had inherited their promise. Okay? And again, remember, Jesus in Matthew 24:14 says that the gospel had to go to all the nations before the end came. Okay? And that's what we see here, don't we? We see that all the people from these nations were redeemed and they were saved, clothed in white. So clearly, Revelation 7 is all about the 12 tribes of Israel. You have the beginning, which is them being sealed, and then you have the second half, which is them receiving their inheritance. And then we go to Revelation 21. Which, by the way, there's no Gentiles in that passage at all. It's all Israel. All right, the Gentiles are nowhere even in that portion there about the resurrection in Revelation 7. But in Revelation 21, when we read about the New Jerusalem and its description, he talks about it coming. He showed me New Jerusalem, the holy city, coming down out of heaven from God and shining with the glory of God. The city shone like a precious stone, like a jasper, clear as crystal. It had a great high wall with 12 gates, and with 12 angels in charge of the gates. On the gates were written the names of the 12 tribes of the people of Israel. Okay, there it is again. The 12 tribes of Israel written on the gates. There were 3 gates on each side, 3 on the east, 3 on the south, 3 on the north, 3 on the west. The city's wall was built on 12 foundational stones, on which were written the names of the 12 apostles of the Lamb. All right, so I won't go any further, but again, all of the city is fully engulfed in and designed with mentionings of the 12 tribes and the 12 apostles. Nobody else. All right, and of course it's New Jerusalem, which is, ideally where they would dwell. All right, but again, there's nobody else in focus there. Then if we go over to 1 Corinthians chapter 15, around verse 22, we read this. For as in Adam all die, even so in Christ all shall be made alive, but each one in his own order. Christ the first fruits, afterward those who are Christ's at his coming. Then comes the end, when he delivers the kingdom to the Father and he puts an end to all rule and all authority and power. Excuse me. All right, so is this end the same end that Jesus spoke of in Matthew 24:14, which we took a look at earlier, which came after all the nations received the gospel? You bet your bottom it is. Okay, this is the end that came. But look at the order. All right, Christ would be raised first. He was the first fruits. And then afterwards, those who are Christ's at his coming. Then comes the end, when he delivers the kingdom back to the Father. Okay, so again, Christ was the first fruits. The rest of those who were Christ were raised at his coming, and then came the end. The same end Jesus said would occur after the gospel went to all the nations, back in Matthew 24:14. But again, nobody else is in focus here. Then we go over to John chapter 6, verse 35. We read, "And Jesus said to them, I am the bread of life. He who comes to me shall never hunger, and he who believes in me shall never thirst. But I say to you that you have seen me, and yet do not believe. All that the Father gives me will come to me, and the one who comes to me I will by no means cast out. For I have come down from heaven, not to do my own will, but the will of him who sent me. This is the will of the Father who sent me, that of all he has given me I should lose nothing, but should raise it up at the last day. And this is the will of him who sent me," ready? "That everyone who sees the Son and believes in him may have everlasting life, and I will raise him up at the last day." So again, when was the last day? Is it the same end that Jesus spoke about in Matthew 24:14, after the gospel went out to all the nations? You bet your bottom it is. And all those who belong to Christ were raised on that last day. There is no continuation there. All right, and then lastly, the Romans 11 portion, which is just a doozy, 11 verse 25 to 27. He says, "For I do not desire, brethren, that you should be ignorant of this mystery, lest you should be wise in your own opinion, that blindness in part has happened to Israel, until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in. And in this way all Israel will be saved. As it is written, the deliverer will come out of Zion, and he will turn away ungodliness from Jacob. For this is my covenant with them when I take away their sins." So we can see that the fullness of the Gentiles, the fullness of those in those nations, had to come in, and in that way all Israel would be saved. And it would be at that time that the deliverer would remove their sins and establish his new covenant with them, with Jacob. Okay, and of course that ties in again with the end and what we see about Jesus saying in Matthew 24:14 that the gospel had to go out to all the nations and then the end would come. So you can see how that actually kind of keeps everything in line. It doesn't allow us to go any further because we know that the gospel was complete and went out to all the nations before the end could take place. All right, and of course, we know that that fullness of the Gentiles coming in is just another way of depicting Revelation 7, which we see all those from the nations standing clothed in white, saying salvation belongs to our God. That was the great multitude that came back in from all the nations, okay? These were the 12 tribes of Israel who were being sealed from all the nations. All right, and then of course we know from Genesis 48, we see the promise that Ephraim's descendants would be a multitude of nations, and that plays a part into this as well, because Ephraim was the northern kingdom who was dispersed into the nations first. So all in all, I think you can see that what I just presented to you is about a dozen passages straight from the Bible that say nothing about anybody else besides Israel inheriting the promise of resurrection. It was the hope of Israel. All those who were going to be raised would be raised on the last day. The fullness of the Gentiles had to come in, and in that way, all Israel would be saved. Paul said that he was bound for the hope of Israel. That was the promise that was given to his fathers. We see that in Daniel chapter 12, the prophet predicts the end, and it would be deliverance for his people and nobody further, and so on and so forth. So I think I've presented you with a lovely outline here of the resurrection. And remember, the ironclad fact here is that Christ says in Matthew 24:14 that the gospel had to go to all the nations before the end could come. So there is no gospel going out to all the nations today at all. Okay, there was an end, it took place, and any attempt at pushing that into our day is false. Anyways, I thank you all for joining me tonight, and I hope you all have a wonderful night, and we'll be back very soon. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.